Okay. Hello, Bob. Thanks for letting me interview you today. You're an instructor at a community college, correct?
Right, St. Clair County Community College in Port Huron, Michigan.
Okay.
And I've spent my entire career in the community college movement.
Okay. And so, what actually are you teaching?
Over the years, recently, I've taught 5 different classes each year. That's through a whole academic year. Intro biology, botany, zoology, a course in environmental issues, and then I also teach a field ecology course.
Okay.
But I'm contemplating retirement right now, so I've been phasing down the last 2 years in the number of courses that I've taught, and I've shipped my courses out to colleagues and done some mentoring in that regard. So, but in the thrust of it all, I taught the 5 different classes each year.
Okay. And how long have you been teaching science?
40 years,
40
plus
years.
a couple years as a graduate teaching fellow.
So
it's a 42-year career that I'll be ending this May.
Wow.
Well, I think ending.
Do you remember what attracted you to science before you?
A lot of it had to do with boyhood experiences with my father. He was a hunter and fishing person, and I spent a great deal of time one-on-one with my dad, other times with 1 or 2 of my brothers, as we hunted and fished. And we spent a lot of time in nature as a result of it. And my dad knew what things were. I mean, he knew what the trees were, he knew most of the flowers, he especially knew animals. So any curiosity about a particular type of wildlife was always, there was an answer there. There was an elaboration on what we were looking at. So I think passively, through all those hours of hunting and fishing and being outdoors, basically, plus being raised in a small community, a small village, where in those days life was a little bit easier. You know, a 10-year-old on a bicycle could claim the town, and much of our experience was outdoors through all that. So when that all accumulated, I guess going into biology just became a practical conclusion when I entered college.
So in a sense, by experiencing and being out in nature, that was
Absolutely.
that this came to you.
There was always a curiosity. My dad used to even play a game sometimes when we would, all 4 of us boys would be in the car, and we'd be driving down to a lake where our grandparents had cottages. That's another part of the exposure. And he would play a game and say, if you can identify any animal before I do, you get a nickel. So he had our attention. You know, a nickel by a fudge-sickle, that sort of thing in those days. So there was the mystique of what is it, and also the quickness and identification. Of course, identification is only one part of nature.
Sure.
But you can't understand interrelationships if you don't know the parts. So knowing what's out there comes first. As a Chinese proverb once indicated, the first step toward wisdom is calling things by their right names. So sometimes we get criticized for just naming things in the sciences, but you have to know the parts before you can comprehend the interrelationships.
Okay.
The 2 are related, clearly.
Well, that actually leads to my next question. You have the the language identifying, but you also have science inquiry and exploration. In your words, how would you define that kind of exploration scientifically?
Well, science that really separates it from non-science is the empirical model, the scientific method. We have to test, we have to inquire, we have to observe and glean data, glean information from the observations or the experiments. And then science has to offer that methodology to be challenged by fellow scientists. And that's the huge gap in some of the debate that's going on right now with, say, equal time of scientific modeling in the classroom in relation to creationism, intelligent design. Those models have no empiricism behind them at all. Where that's the huge difference. And I think it's important with this, even at elementary level, is that students are learning the differences between science and non-science. There is no overlap. They're separate entities. It's very important that children learn this when they're very, very young. Trying to overlap science and non-science is where we get into trouble.
How would you do that for a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old?
Teach them the importance of what an experiment is, even in very, very simple terms, where you gather information and then you draw conclusions from that information. You can't lie in bed in the morning and just think up ideas and have them become your facts. You have to go out and actually establish observed or experimental information. That's the huge difference.
Okay, great. What kind of suggestions do you have for the teachers of young children about getting them started with this kind of exploration?
I think it's exposure, it's getting them out. You know, so often today kids are bound in homes. Life is complex on the streets. A lot of parents, you know, aren't allowing their kids to walk to and from school. They're being driven and dropped off, and when they come home, they oftentimes go to their electronic toys rather than experiencing the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's exposure, it's getting them out. When you look at a tree, it's not just a tree, but it's a certain kind of tree. When a butterfly flies by, it's not just an insect, but it's a very specific kind of butterfly. It's those specifics, it's those details through exposure that then lead to inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
But if basically my attitude is if children, I speak mainly from a biological perspective and not science across the board, but if kids don't have the exposure in nature today, if they don't have some kind of life process, life experience with nature, then as adults they're not going to defend the importance of protecting these natural spaces. You can't, it's difficult to love something and care about something that you haven't experienced. So exposure, exposure, exposure from any perspective, from just daily activities, going to and from school, to family vacations, to just the routines that you have around the home from week to week.
Now, if a teacher has little experience with, say, the names of the different butterflies, is that accessible to teachers?
There's a massive volume of literature, some very, very excellent books from the little teeny golden nature guides that I had when I was a kid that are still around, to these wonderful eyewitness series today, and lots of things in between. Even the Peterson Field guides, even the Audubon nature guides have cut down versions for children.
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to get to this. As teachers, to allow kids to bring things in, even if you don't know what they are, can start a whole process toward discovery. And the teacher can discover right along with the kids. But I think it's important that you have the atmosphere in the classroom to allow the kids to bring unknowns in that lead to then other areas of inquiry and advancement.
Mm-hmm.
And the teacher surely can embrace it as they go. It reminds me of a story. In Marysville, several years ago, there was an elementary teacher that called me to come in and talk about spiders. And I had a bunch of slides, some really good close-ups of spiders, and I also had a lot of specimens that I brought in. And how they happened to study spiders is back through this aspect that we're talking about now. A student brought in a daddy longlegs, or what's called a harvestman, or an opleonid. It's an arachnid, which all the spiders belong to. They're arachnids. But as they got studying the daddy longlegs, the question was, when a student brought it in, is this a spider? And they discovered that a daddy longlegs is not a spider. It's an arachnid. It has 4 pairs of walking legs, and it has special mouth parts and some other associated mouth parts called pedipalps that they all have in common. Why isn't it a spider? Because spiders have spinnerets and they have silk glands. And allies of spiders like daddy longlegs and scorpions and ticks and mites are arachnids, but they're not spiders. So here's a group of kids in a middle elementary level classroom that just through the entry of someone brought in a daddy longlegs got into the whole aspect of studying the arachnids in their entirety, what real spiders were in relation to their allies, and it led into a whole unit, it led into a guest speaker, etc., etc. And that happened probably 10 or 15 years ago, and then the same teacher called just this past year. and was working back into that process again. So
That's an excellent
it,
example.
it was one of those things where the teacher didn't know what the daddy long legs was to start with. But here, by having an open attitude and allowing the kids to inquire, it led to a very comprehensive unit.
Excellent, excellent example. Thank you. Now you have a son who that is a good friend of mine,
Right.
and he's a science teacher at the high school level right now. And I know he studied microbiology. Is that correct?
As an undergrad, he specialized in microbiology.
Right. So I'm seeing a connection here that I didn't know about. That maybe it began with your father. What were the kind of things that you did with Andrew to, spark his interest in science?
We traveled a great deal. With my wife and I both being teachers, we had time that we always protected a couple months in the summer where we could do things outdoors. And in those days, I was getting grants to travel across the country. We went to New York and California and Utah and Colorado and so forth for different courses. We decided that what was affordable for travel as a family was camping, which of course enhances the outdoor experience. So all three of our kids, from when they were in diapers all the way to where they got to pretty much their early teens, did tent camping across the countryside. And Andrew was part of that along with his brother and sister. And it's not only Andrew, the one that teaches science in high school level today, but his brother took a science group major. He's an elementary teacher. And his sister is, even though she works in senior care, has a passion for seashore life in particular. She has very extensive shell collection. As a kid, she collected Petoskey stones off of Lake Huron. So I guess what started this is when you camp outdoors, obviously there's all the little day hikes and all the observations that you make because you're out in it that just developed a passion for nature.
Mm-hmm.
And once you get into nature, all the auxiliary sciences come into play. We went to beautiful geologic areas, and chemistry and physics, all of that blends into it as well.
Now, outside of those camping trips, would you have spontaneous moments that you would show the world to Andrew that way?
Absolutely. Everything from birds mating out in the yard to our kids walking back and forth to grade school all the years they went to grade school, and that part of the walk was through a small woodlot. So there were times when they brought in toads that were mating, and we listened to them croak. We had them in a can. That was our dinner music for dinner one night, is the toad croaking rather. And one time Pat found a cicada that was just emerging from its nymphal encasement. So we watched that whole hatch and photographed it in the yard. Another time the kids brought in sow bugs that were actually delivering young, that they have a little brood pouch underneath them. They were hatching young. So there were moments like that over years where the kids found things and brought them in. And they knew they could ask questions and get some answers. And I, of course, always had all kinds of literature around that they could explore further. So Andrew was part of that activity, and I guess that's why he went on and pursued biology.
Mm-hmm. Well, last question. If you could tell teachers one thing about teaching science to young children, what would that be?
Don't avoid it. There's a huge avoidance, I think, with a lot of elementary teachers because they don't have the background in science. Try to have an inquiry table, a science table, something where plants are growing, where seeds are sprouting, where you might have a small aquarium or an herbarium. If you have magnifying lenses, if you're lucky, and you could have maybe even a dissection scope if you had a budget or could get a used one somehow. To where there's always an inquiry table where there's activity going on. It's amazing the spin-off that comes out of that. If you find something interesting to bring in, to stimulate it, then I think you model for the students to get them to look around when they're playing and to bring things in, and even if you don't know what it is, let's find out. And you start with the mystique, and then other questions that are more scientific based can spin out of it. So make it possible is the important thing. My wife, who's taught in elementary, the early level elementary ed for many, many years, taught, this is dating it, but it was a process called Math Their Way, which I think there's an aspect called Chicago math and so forth. This is not my specialty, but I know it's manipulative math. It's an introduction to arithmetic concepts through manipulation without using any of the mathematical symbols, and using things from nature, things from science for the manipulation can be like an integrated dual-purpose teaching. So she's had students group and separate and add to and take from a whole variety of seashells, and they're learning all this marine life while they're also learning the mathematical concepts. And there's opportunity for that, from leaves to seeds to fruits to even different aspects of more sophisticated components if you have access to them that deal more with chemistry and physics and geology. I mean, rocks, minerals, all of that. Teachers can bring some of their natural hobbies in and incorporate that dimension of knowledge into other things that they're teaching simultaneously.
Do you think teachers have to cover all areas of science, or should they just get started where they can?
Well, we have the state benchmarks that pretty well lay out where students should be. What examples you use, though, is wide open for the teacher. And it's a matter of get something that you're comfortable with as a teacher, and then expand yourself through the application in your classroom. There's no reason why any person can't start learning leaves or different kinds of fruits or seeds or seashells or butterflies just through the initial inquiry along with the students, or back to my story dealing with the spiders. And there's an abundance of literature, and the kids can clip right along with you and learn it.
Okay, well, thank you. I think this is very helpful. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Thank you.